Hello and welcome to this video discussing Chapter 4, Market Segmentation and Positioning. This chapter focuses on what people often refer to as the STP model of marketing. The idea behind that is that we segment our markets. We take that segmentation and then choose to target a particular group. And then finally, a discussion of how we position our product or service for that targeted group. The next slide has a short video that explains the STP model in a little more detail.
When it comes to marketing, not every customer is treated the same way. That's because various groups of customers react differently to various combinations of marketing efforts. The STP, segmentation, targeting, positioning method, can help you understand how marketers group, select, and approach multiple customer segments. The method works like this. First, segmentation is the division of the market into groups where the people in those groups are similar in the way that they react to certain marketing elements, for example, product, price, promotion, and distribution. Although many marketers still group by demographic characteristics, psychographic or behavioral grouping often works much better. Targeting is the process of selecting the groups or segments that are the most attractive to the short-term and/or long-term success of the product, organization, and/or marketing efforts. Finally, positioning involves how the product and brand attributes are developed and communicated in order to establish an identity that resonates with a targeted customer segment. Remember, no customer is exactly the same as another, but groups of similar customers can be served efficiently through segmentation, targeting, and positioning.
Let's begin with the first element of the STP model, market segmentation. Your text defines market segmentation as pursuing a marketing strategy whereby the total potential market is divided into homogeneous subsets of customers, each of which responds differently to the marketing mix of the organization. The key phrase there in blue is homogeneous subsets of customers. It's how you divide them into groups where the people react to the marketing message, or they treat the product, or they have similar needs. So they have some characteristic that ties them together. Demographics in the early days were that characteristic. They would tie people together by age or by sex or something like that. However, recently behavioral or attitudinal measures, values and lifestyles approaches have been found to be much more effective for grouping people for a market segment. So how do marketers go about segmenting different groups? There are various strategies that can be used, but they can basically be lumped into three different categories. The first one is the mass market strategy, where one product service mix element is provided for all potential customers. Basically, we treat everybody the same and assume they all will approach our product or service similarly. Very few products is it effective to use this as a marketing strategy. The second general category is the differentiated strategy, where more than one market segment is created and they have a separate marketing program for each of the segments. This is much more effective because you can target your messages, you can position your service so that it approaches one particular segment one way based on their needs and what they're looking for, and you can position it with a different market segment based on what they're looking for. And then finally is the concentrated strategy. In this one you have one or maybe a very few number of market segments, and you make very limited changes in the marketing plan based on that. So how do we decide which market segments to create? There are a number of different types of criteria that you can use to decide this, but it basically the four most common are mentioned here. The first one is substantiality. Is the market segment going to be large enough to warrant our attention? You can divide groups up into narrower and narrower groups and get very specific, but the question is there going to be enough business generated by that particular segment to warrant the attention that we're giving to it and the resources that we're expending to reach that particular group? The second is measurability. What is the potential demand and purchasing power of the people within that segment? Is it worth it for us to devote our resources to reaching them? Third is accessibility. Is it possible for us to even reach this particular segment with the variety of communication tools that we have available in the communications toolbox? There are segments that you can define very clearly and would be wonderful, but if you can't reach them, there's not much point. And finally, fourth, actionability. Consumers in the same segment should react similarly to the marketing program. If we're putting people together, we want to make sure that the communication messages in the marketing program that we create, pricing and everything else, is set up so that the individuals within that segment will react similarly when they're exposed to those marketing messages. So you now know the four major criteria that are used for developing different and effective market segments. However, as the video described earlier, there are a variety of different ways that we can create the segments and different variables that we can use. One of the most common early on was a demographic variable such as income, family size, or age. But more recently, people have found that psychographic measures someone's lifestyle, the interest that they hold, or behavioral dimensions, how often they purchase a particular product or from a product category, what kind of travel they prefer. Those kinds of things are more likely to predict and help us to create a segment that will allow us to predict how they will respond to a particular marketing campaign. A couple of the other variables that are used are the benefits sought. This is really the most fundamental of all the variables. What are people looking for from your particular service? Are they looking for a particular price point? Are they concerned about the location? Is it close to them? Are they concerned about convenience? Often these are considered to be part of the psychographic and behavioral dimensions. So we include that with geography, country, region, state, metropolitan statistical area. All of these are different factors that you can use to create a segment. If, for example, we had a small microbrew that had wood-fired ovens that produced pizzas, you might look at these different segment variables and decide that while that restaurant might serve an entire community, people come to it for different benefits that they're seeking. Some of those benefits might include, some of them might be much more interested in the pizza than the microbrew element of it. So simply dividing along the food or the beverage line of the restaurant may develop very quickly different groups. And then within those two segments of food and drink, you're also going to have people that are at different behavioral dimensions. So you'll have people who are come to eat fairly regularly. They have their favorites. Then you'll have people who are microbrew fans, and some will come very sporadically, and others will come very often and are considered regulars. So all of these segmentation variables can be used to define different segments and how those segments are going to react to the marketing campaign that you're creating. This example of market segmentation from your text shows you how you move from a non-segmented market, basically treating everybody the same as a mass market, and then taking that and dividing by a variety of different variables. So in figure 1A, we have a non-segmented market. 1B, we have one that's been segmented by age. And then in 1C, you can see one segmented by income. And then finally in 1D, where they've done age and income. And the more variables you can put together inside the market segmentation, the narrower and narrower the segments get, and the more it allows you to target your messages. But remember, then we have to go back and ask ourselves the criteria for the different market segments. Is it substantial? Will it provide sufficient demand? Do we have a way of accessing one? And as they get more and more narrow, that's more difficult to do. And are the consumers within these narrower markets going to react the same way to our campaign or actionability? Here you see two different models describing the different segmentation variables in the four most common categories of geographic, demographic, behavioral, and psychographic. What's interesting in this is they give you some examples of the types of reactions that people may have to campaigns and the different variables within each category. If you look at the model on the right, you'll notice in psychographic there's a note to VALs, or values, attitudes, and lifestyles. And this particular one is a great way of defining how people will react, how they make decisions, what kind of personality they have, and what kind of life they lead. These dimensions, along with behavioral dimensions of usage rate, benefits sought, and so forth, are often the most effective ways of creating a market segment. You can spend an awful lot of time creating market segments, but unless you do something with those segments, it doesn't serve much of a purpose. So one of the key things that you have to do is step 2 in the STP model, and that's to create your target markets. So you look at your different segmentation and you identify of those different segment bases. Then you need to develop profiles of each of the segments to help you determine which ones you're going to target. You forecast in those profiles what the potential demand is from each of the segments, what kind of income they have, and how much they desire the service you're providing. And then finally select specific target markets. Figure 4.2 in your text talks about this 4-step process. The final step in the STP model is the P step, which is positioning. And as defined in your text, this is the process of determining how to differentiate a firm's offerings from those of its competitors in the minds of the consumers. We often want to develop a campaign to sell a product or service, but one of the things that you have to consider is that everybody else who's a competitor is trying to do the same thing. So we need to figure out how to differentiate our offerings from those that are provided by the customers. And the key is not in reality, but the key is in the minds of the consumers, how they're seeing our services that are being provided. The 4-step positioning process described in your text and exemplified in figure 4.3 indicates that the first step is to determine what the ideal mix is for consumers. Second, measure consumer perceptions of available services. What do they currently think of what we have available? Third, look for gaps in coverage and select a desired position. So once we know how people view the services you're providing and the services of your competitors, we can look for gaps and try to move our product into that gap and put it into a desirable position where there's less competition. And then finally, develop a strategy for obtaining that desired position. So once we know where we want to be, we have to develop a strategy that will get us so that in the minds of the consumers, they perceive our service as being in that position. Each category in the hospitality industry has a different list of attributes that are important for that particular area. For example, in restaurant, price is important, like it is. Price and value are important, like they are in most of the other categories. But of course, quality of food is particularly important. The friendliness of your staff, location, the atmosphere, the speed at which you serve them, and the cleanliness are critical factors for the restaurant industry that might not apply to some of the other segments. The hotel industry, for example, whether you have a pool or fitness center, might be of particular importance to a particular market that you're trying to reach, a target market that you've selected and that you're focusing your campaign upon. As noted in the previous slide, the attributes that are important for each segment of the travel and tourism industry will vary. For example, in the airline industry, of course, having direct routes or routes that are attractive to individuals or where they want to travel, how their baggage is handled, frequent flyer programs that you have are going to be critically important. So while price, value, service quality tend to be true across the board in the entire travel and tourism industry, each segment has their own attributes that are particularly important. So now that we know what attributes are important in our particular area of service, the next step is to move on to step 2, which is to measure how consumers currently perceive our service offerings as compared to those of our competitors. One of the techniques used to do this is called perceptual mapping. It's a technique that visually represents how the consumers in the market perceive your service offerings as well as those of your competitors. And the first step in that is to create what's known as a competitive benefit matrix, where you go and list all the potential benefits that you provide or that you think are important to individuals within the market segment that you're targeting. And then you go to them and collect information on how they perceive your offerings and the offerings of all of your competitors. There are a variety of ways of creating a perceptual map, but they must contain at least 2 different variables that you think are particularly important, and then they must visually demonstrate how your brand compares to competitors. In this one, you see the difference between the airline brand A and airline brand B. And in there, they have a variety of different characteristics, and they compare how each of the airlines does on the characteristics, whether it's a brand weakness or a brand strength, and then also whether or not individuals in their target segments view this as being an important one or an unimportant one. And if you look at this, you'll see that many of them are very similar. For example, do the airlines have a schedule that I need? Both brands A and B are very similar. Do they have a route I need? Very similar. And so what you're looking for are places where in the minds of the consumers, your brand is particularly strong and your competitor is particularly weak. And also if that is considered an important attribute for them in determining which airline they're going to select. And if you can find a strength, that allows you to see that as a strength of your organization, allows you to develop your campaign and position your services based on that strength. This perceptual map from the hotel industry is a little bit different because instead of having the attributes on the map, the two different axes are the attributes themselves. So one of the attributes is the perceived price, which is the vertical axis, and that one, those with perceived higher price are in the upper half and the lower price in the bottom half. And then the second one, the horizontal axis, is the perceived quality, with low quality on the left and high quality on the right. And by looking at this, you can see, depending upon which hotel chain you are interested in, you can see how they compare to others. You can also see who are their primary competitors, and you can also look for, are there any open spots in the market. So for example, looking at this map, you can see that the Hampton Inn and the Days Inn are fairly close. They're perceived as being below average costs, but not significantly below, and they're also being seen as having about the same perceived quality. So if I was doing a marketing campaign for Hampton Inn, my primary competitor would likely be Days Inn. My primary competitor would not be a Four Seasons Resort. This allows us to figure out who our competition is, and it also allows us, as I said, to try and find some position in here that isn't being served, that doesn't have a lot of competition. And the question is whether or not we can move in the minds of the consumers the services we provide to that position. Similar to the hotel perceptual map you just saw, this map of different types of beer has the one of the characteristics being price, or perceived value in this case. But because this is about beer, one of the other attributes is very different than you'd find in the hotel industry, and that's the strength of the beer. Is it considered strong or very light? And again, you can see by the position of the different brands on this map how they're perceived in the mind of the consumer and who their major competitors are. Step 3 in the process of positioning your service involves looking for a gap in the coverage, as I exemplified in the perceptual maps that you just saw in step 2, and then developing a desired position for your particular brand. And that desirable position might be your current position. So you're looking for a positioning statement. Results from the consumer research and the perceptual mapping enable firms to develop a positioning statement. That statement should differentiate the organization's product-service mix from that of its competition. It should be easy for consumers to differentiate between you and your competitors, and one of the ways that they do that is through your USP, your unique selling proposition. And this is the promotion of a particular element of your service or product that you're providing that distinguishes it in the mind of the consumer. And it doesn't always need to be a real differentiation. It could be something that you tout as being unique to your particular brand, and as long as it's viewed as being unique to your brand in the mind of the consumer, then that is the position that they will hold, and that's what helps separate it from the competition. Finally, step 4 of the positioning process is the effort that you make to try and obtain the desired position that you're looking for. Can you, in the mind of the consumers, be seen as holding a particular position in your product category, your service category? So some of the guidelines for developing the positioning statements are indicated by the questions that are provided here. So we start with what position do you own? Your research should tell you that. You should have identified what position you want, whether that be your current position or a different position. Who are your primary competitors going to be? Who do you have to outgun? Do you have enough money? Do you have the time, the resources in order to achieve the position that you desire? Can you stick it out? Is it possible for you to devote the resources long term to not only reach that position but to hold that position? And then the final question is probably one of the most important. Do you match your position? If you're trying to establish a position in the mind of the consumer of what your service is like, there has to be some basis in reality to it. You can't position yourself as one thing but have reality be another, because eventually the consumers will note that and you will be unable to maintain that position. The classic example of that, of course, is the city of Las Vegas that tried a number of years ago, 15, 20 years ago, to identify themselves as a family-friendly destination. When that failed miserably because nobody really believed that Las Vegas was a family-friendly destination, they were unable to establish the position that they wanted, and it reverted back to the position that consumers had in their mind of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation related to Chapter 4 on the STP model, and I wish you great luck in studying the material. And remember, if you have any questions, you should be sure to contact me, and I'll do my best to answer them.